Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the latest segment of EFF's Affecting Change livestream series, where our panelists tackle the latest issues in civil liberties and human rights in technology and the digital world. And if you're here for the first time, welcome. This might be something you want to tune in before because we do this quite often, but today is a really special event because this is our 35th anniversary as an organization. Even saying that kind of freaks me out a little bit. 35 years, oh my goodness. And we have a really special panel for you today. So my name is Cindy Cohen. I am proudly the executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I'm going to be your host for today's program. Before we proceed, let me get through a couple of housekeeping items to go over. First of all, we're going to be recording this session, but only the video of the speakers is going to be included. So folks who are participating through their questions or in the chat, you're not going to be included. It'll be just us, but there are many people who wanted to watch this who couldn't tune in right at this time, and we want to make it available for them. Please do join us in the official chat via Twitch at EFF.org/livestream. You can drop your questions in throughout this. We'll be gathering them, and when we get to the question time at the end, we'll have some ready there. Also, if you want to just say hi, say hi. One of the funnest things about EFF events is getting to meet other people who are as interested in digital rights as you are. So please say hello in the chat, say where you're tuning in from, or maybe the issues that you're passionate about, just so that we're building a bit of community with this as well. For those of you who may have just tuned in and don't quite know who we are, the Electronic Frontier Foundation is a nonprofit whose technologists, activists, and attorneys have been fighting for your online privacy, free speech, and innovation since June 10th, 1990. You are the reason that EFF can take on our important work. We stand for the users, and we work to make sure that technology serves everyone. As we are increasingly living in this technological age, we survive and are supported by member donations. If you think what we're doing is important, as I sometimes like to say, we work for tips. Please consider donating at EFF.org/support change, or even from our main website. And while you're there, you can pick up a cool bit of EFF merch. We have awesome merch. This is the shirt I'm wearing is from our 20th anniversary, and the hoodie I'm wearing came from a few years ago. We have brand new 35th anniversary merch, which is super cool. So it's not only what I tell the EFF staffers, it's not only a job, it's a wardrobe, but it can also not only be a membership, but a wardrobe for you as well. We have tons of really cool stuff. But with that, let me go ahead and welcome our speakers. We have three amazing speakers here who represent really different strands of what EFF does. The first is they are Lee Tien, Jillian York, and Yoshi Kono. So let me start with Lee Tien. Lee is the EFF's legislative director. So that means he leads all of our work in legislative bodies, whether that's the U.S. Congress and the California or state legislatures, or even increasingly some of the work we do with local boards of supervisors and otherwise. Lee and I started at EFF on the very same day in September of 2000. So he has the breadth of understanding of who EFF is that is really unmatched. And I mean unmatched because his memory is better than mine. But we've been doing this together for a very long time. The issues that our legislative team and Lee are working on today include censorship, AI, age verification, consumer privacy, and many, many more. I've long called Lee the Spock to my Kirk, and we've really enjoyed working together. So it's especially fun for me to have him on our 35th anniversary live stream. Next up is Jillian York, who is the EFF Director for International Freedom of Expression. She's currently in London, so she stayed up late for us. And she focuses on state and corporate censorship, and its impact on culture and human rights. She is a force of nature, as anyone who's had to try to oppose her can attest. And she has always worked with historically marginalized communities, both in the US, but especially around the world and in the Arab region. And third is a member of EFF's board of directors, Yoshi Kono. Formerly, Yoshi is the incoming McDevitt Chair in Computer Science, Ethics, and Society, and professor in the Department of Computer Science and the Center for Digital Ethics at Georgetown University. Yoshi is not only a member of our board, but a former satisfied client of EFF, and he's going to bring that perspective to us today as well. So this is just really exciting for me. Just what we're going to try to do today, we're going to try to pull on some of the strands that have been consistent in our work over the past 35 years, but also talk about some of the ways that the organization has grown and responded to the changes as the internet has become more and more important. In the 1990s when EFF was started, there was an internet, but EFF predates the World Wide Web. We also predate the mobile internet. As well as the rise of the tech giants. But throughout this time, our core values, our core issues of protecting free speech, privacy, and innovation have remained the same, even as some of the techniques and strategies we've used to stand up for them have changed as the times have changed. Some examples of that we'll talk about a little more is, EFF, when EFF started, we didn't have a former technology team. Now we have a formal technology team. We didn't have a formal activism team, and now we have a formal activism team. So just in terms of the three pillars of our work, law, tech, and activism, two of those pillars have been formally added since we've started. And, our legislative work, as I'll talk about a little with Lee, is something that EFF was pretty timid about in the 90s and has gone more and more strong in engaging with those things. And our international work is something that the organization didn't really focus on earlier, but that we've grown over time. And along with those things, we've shifted our strategies as well. So those are the kinds of things we want to talk about. We really want to celebrate 35 years and the breadth of the work this organization has done. I like to say that as the internet has grown, EFF has grown along with it, and hopefully grown both in terms of the breadth and the diversity of the organization and the issues we take on, along with the kind of sheer size of the organization. We're going to set aside about 15 to 20 minutes for your questions at the end. So as I said at the top, if you have them as we go along, please go ahead and put them in the chat. And our wonderful backstage supporters, Aaron, Ju, and Melissa, will gather them and help us present them at the end. So let's start. EFF, one of the early issues that EFF worked on is government surveillance. Sorry, just checking that. We started with government surveillance, and that was really our focus a lot in the 90s in terms of our battles to free up encryption, to try to give you the ability to protect yourself against surveillance and increase your security. For a time in the 2000s, I would hear from people that the government wasn't really a concern. We should really focus on corporate censorship and corporate privacy violations, which of course we did and have done. But I would say that right now, 35 years in, sadly, government surveillance is back. But I also think we've reached a new moment where people are starting to recognize that corporate surveillance and government surveillance are intertwined. And it always was the case that they were, but now I think we see very much as some of the leaders of the surveillance companies are really much more directly involved in government surveillance. So that's one of the things. And I don't know, Lee, if you want to comment a little bit about kind of the legislative space on surveillance and encryption and what you're seeing now in the current debates.
Well, I wanted to sort of harken back to one of our very, very early fights, which was in the media. And back in those days, this was probably 1999, 2000, before even 9/11 came along. But we were dealing with concerns about government seizure of machines and servers, and that all came together in the media battle up in Seattle and area server seizure. So that strikes me as one of the things that, when I think back, reminds me of what Doge has been doing, like in the last few years. But back then, they were hitting hobbyists. They were hitting folks that had at the local level, and this is actually these days acting on the government owned databases, which is an even greater threat from a privacy standpoint.
Yep. Yeah. And one of the things that EFF has done in that regard, in terms of the government mining its own data to surveil people and violate their privacy, is our case against the Office of Personnel Management that we launched, along with representing a couple of the American Federation of Government Employees and the American Administrative Law Judges, to stand up for people's privacy in the information that they must give to the government. We also just filed a brief in the case involving the IRS handing data over to ICE. This idea that if the government is grabbing information for one purpose, even if that purpose is legitimate, it isn't just open season for it to be used for other things, is something we see at all levels of government. It's a piece of the fight around the National Security Agency as well, whether the FBI is going to have access to the information that the NSA captures off of databases, which people in DC call the backdoor search problem. It's the same structure, which is, from our principled position, if information is gathered for one purpose, it should be used for that purpose, and as a privacy matter, it shouldn't be allowed to be reused for other purposes. Let's talk a little bit about online censorship and how that issue kind of has changed over time. And I'm wondering, Jillian, if you wanted to speak a little bit to that.
Sure. Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, I mean, I've been at EFF for 14 years. So I came in 2011 at a time where online censorship was being talked about all over the place, because we were seeing the kind of first waves of internet shutdowns in various countries. I think the ones that I recall from the time, Myanmar, then Egypt in 2011, of course, and a few others. And so a lot of this was talk about government censorship, but then we also saw a lot of challenges towards corporations acting on behalf of government. So Vodafone being complicit in the Egyptian internet shutdown. And then later on, of course, all of the conversations that started really around that time about the corporate platforms, whether we're talking about Meta, X, et cetera, engaging in shutting down various types of speech. So EFF has long now engaged with companies around the censorship of individuals on platforms, and not what we would, of course, traditionally call censorship, not state censorship, but so much of this is intertwined, whether we're thinking about government requests for content being removed, or just platforms making these decisions for themselves. And EFF now has a bunch of projects that are looking at that.
Yeah, and I think we've done a lot of work over time trying to lift up and draw attention to how this impacts maybe people around the world a little differently than the way sometimes it gets portrayed in the US. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, because I think it informs our perspectives a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, when I came on around that time, I was really concerned at the impact that platforms could have on speech in places where there aren't really other opportunities for people to speak out. And so, if you bring yourselves back to around 2010, 2011, this was the time where blogs were really on the rise, where people were seeking out alternative media sources. I mean, Lee mentioned indie media, and I think a lot of that came out of that era. And so from my perspective, really what matters here is the fact that platforms have, and centralized platforms historically have offered people a unique way to reach different audiences, whether we're talking about coordinating protests or trying to engage with people across borders, or just seeking out essential information. And so I think EFF was pretty early to recognize the outsized role that platforms can play in controlling that type of speech. And so we've done a lot of advocacy working with different groups around the world to try to bring those perspectives to light. And of course, course, this matters a lot in the US too. We're seeing protest movements in the US being silenced on these platforms as well. And I think that our perspective being informed from the international space has really helped there.
Yeah, I think that's right. Lee, one of the things we talked about that I think is important is EFF has always taken on issues around intellectual property, because I think we've really recognized early on, and some of this is the pioneering work of our current board member Pam Samuelson, recognizing how copyright law could end up being the censorship tool if it wasn't properly balanced. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that kind of recognition and how we've really kind of been sometimes alone or a very lonely voice kind of talking about how copyright could be a tool for censorship.
Well, absolutely. And it's not just copyright, it's all versions of intellectual property law. I feel like one of the earliest issues that we had was the use of trademarks by companies in order to squelch dissent on the internet, because there were a lot of folks who wanted to complain about corporate behavior, and they would put up domains like Nike sucks or whatever. They would get in trouble for trademark reasons. And this was all part of the larger sort of domain name and cyber squatting issue that was important to the internet back in those days. And I think no one heard about cyber squatting for probably the last 10 or 15 years. But in addition to that, we did a lot of work in what I think of as censorship of technical speech, as we are not even talk about where the EFF started with Bernstein, which is one of the most original versions of censorship of speech around source code. But even without that, the example that comes to mind for me is when the Ed Felton and his team at Princeton, along with a bunch of academics, entered the SDMI challenge, which was something that the recording industry said, hey, we've got this great watermarking technology. It's going to address piracy and copy protection. And Ed and his team figured out how to break it, showed how watermarking does not work. That was true then, it's still true today. But they were threatened by the RIA about presenting a paper at a conference. And, basically this was based on the DMCA. The idea, a paper that explained how to break this form of watermark was in fact a circumvention device under the DMCA. And so, we engaged a great deal of work to actually allow these researchers to produce and to actually publish their paper. It was a case where we didn't win the case, but we were able to get publication of the paper. And, when I look back at it, more than anything else, it was the publication of the paper that was more important. The one other example in that area I'll give is when Bunny figured out how to reverse engineer the Xbox, and we realized at the time that Microsoft would not be very, very happy about that. And this was not a case, but I spent a lot of time working with MIT and Microsoft and Professor Hal Abelson in trying to figure out how to allow Bunny to publish a paper about how he did that without fear of legal liability. And so these were early cases where our counseling of researchers really led to getting academic work about the technology actually published. So those are my examples.
Yeah, I think those are both really good examples of how one of the things that we also recognized early on is how important the internet was going to be for science. for developing science and scientific ideas, and how that included not only publishing papers like Professor Felton did, but also, publishing code, which is what we were talking about in the Bernstein case, where our client, Dan Bernstein, wanted to publish computer code. And I think that's really one of the heartlands of how we've always thought about what the internet could do and what needed protected was, this was not just a place, it was always a place for free speech around politics and around culture and around all sorts of other things, but it was a vitally important place for science. And I think we were really some of the first and the loudest champions of that in ways that people, might be familiar with if you track our work, but also might not understand as much as happened behind the scenes. And that's a perfect segue to Yoshi, because Yoshi's, comes out of the world of science and coding. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit about, how you see EFF and EFF's role in the world.
Oh gosh, the answer of how I see EFF's role in the world is huge because of the outsized impact that EFF has. But to dovetail specifically off your question and what Lee said, I echo a lot of Lee's comments and beliefs. The background for those of people who are not involved in research and academia is that, at least within my subdiscipline of computer science research, which is computer security, a lot of our research is focused on uncovering the risks and harms that technologies can create, with the ultimate goal of advancing society and advancing technology to mitigate those harms. Industry, from some perspective, understandably, doesn't necessarily like it when academics publish research papers that demonstrate the harms or security flaws with those technologies. And it is in this space that the EFF has had, for me personally, an invaluable and outsized impact. And the reason being is that I remember many times throughout the course of my academic career, both as a student and then as a faculty member later, being uncertain of how to proceed with my research, including how to do it and how to publish it. I knew that the research was important. I knew that the research, once completed, would benefit society, but I wanted to have guidance and help in figuring out how to do so in a way that would, both be legal and it would minimize the harms to the team. And this is where the EFF has had a huge impact, not just on me, but actually on the careers of my students. So I can give you a few concrete examples just to put this in context. Over the course of my career, I've been fortunate enough to work on topics ranging from electronic voting security to automotive security to medical device security to copyright and DMCA. In all of these cases, I truly believe that the work that we did helped enable the modern fields of electronic voting security and automotive security and medical device security and so on. And this work would not have been possible had it not been for the EFF's role in helping us navigate some of the challenges we encountered. And also, I would say that the careers of many of our students who have been involved in these projects that then later went on to be, academia and other places would also not have been possible if it were not for the EFF.
Yeah, that's great. And, we were so delighted to be able to ask you to join our board of directors to kind of keep that perspective really strong. I think coders' rights issues, which is these days led by Andrew Crocker, one of our senior staff attorneys, is really something core to kind of our place in the world and how we see ourselves, kind of in the earliest of times and stretching through today. As DEF CON approaches every year, we hear from security researchers who are doing things about wanting to make sure we navigate this. We've really seen a huge change in the way that companies respond, from outright hostility, threatening to put people in jail, actually getting somebody arrested at DEF CON, a guy named Dmitry Sklarov in the early days of my time at EFF, to embracing this and having, bug bounties and really supporting this. And I think this is the work of the kind of dogged researchers and academic communities with support from us that we've really, this is a change that I think is really important, but also sometimes a little, not as headliney as, the Snowden leaks demonstrating that we were right about mass surveillance. Well, one of the things we wanted to talk about is kind of the ways that EFF has changed over the past 35 years, and the kind of how we really adapted to the times. And I think one of the ones that is the biggest is the one that Lee heads now, which is really getting engaged with the legislatures. I think EFF started at a time when the legislatures were not very thoughtful about the internet. I think they're still not very thoughtful about the internet. I think what we've changed over times is realizing that we can make some gains if we engage with them at a level, as opposed to trying to distance ourselves from that. So Lee, this is the work that you took on, kind of because we needed somebody to do it, and I
Yes.
want to hear your view of how we started and how is it going.
Well, I guess I would start by saying we were always really hostile to doing legislative work because of our past in DC. When we came out to California, we had sort of wanted to not think about the legislature and focus on impact litigation. And yet, as we looked at the threats to people, such as the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which was a product of Congress. It predated us, product of the Robert Morris work. But we saw how bad that law was and how it could be used in many ways against researchers. But throughout that period, with a lot of fights of the government over the like escrowed encryption with the government, we did not get very much into the congressional battle until the Patriot Act, until after 9/11. I think for a while there, we weren't sure what our role was going to be in this area of government surveillance and privacy. And then after 9/11, it became very obvious that DC was serious about counterterrorism, and there was a huge amount of surveillance that was coming. And I still remember the fax machine operating in the office at Otwell and having successive drafts of the so-called ATA and the MATA coming through every hour. And the Patriot Act was enacted within about a month. And there was nothing we were able to do about it except for stare at it and scream. And it was after that we decided, right, as a group, that we had to actually engage with Congress. That meant we had to develop expertise in the electronic surveillance laws, which, whether the Wiretap Act, the Stored Communications Act, and most notoriously, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And digging into that required sort of full-time dedication to a legislative program. And so out of that concern for the Patriot Act and how national security surveillance was going to be conducted, we started to engage with Congress and congressional staff on national security and other issues that we had technical expertise on. And over the years, that led to relationships that are still really important. I mean, I remember with the concerns over computer security, I worked closely with Senator Franklin's chief counsel, Alvaro Bedoya, who has since become, and then fired or resigned from the FTC, a tremendous force in our space for both privacy and for treating people humanely. So we really focused on the legislative work in DC, and since then, as we've grown our team, we've been able to expand to Sacramento because California really is the other hub of technology, policy, and legislation in the United States. By handling those two areas, we've been able to have an outsized influence on the legislative agenda to get that used.
Yeah, I think that's right, and our work has been bipartisan, right? Especially around the surveillance issues. There was when we started in the encryption fight, John Ashcroft, who was then a senator, was our chief champion. Even though we weren't as engaged then, but even after the Patriot Act, people like Rand Paul and other folks. So it's definitely, we've always tried to stay true to our principles, and if you take principled positions, we're going to stand with you, and if you don't, then you may be a fair weather friend sometimes and not in other times. As it turned out, John Ashcroft was
even
pretty
today
good.
on national security reform, we still are able to talk to the Freedom Caucus, who doesn't really talk to a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's a really important value for us, that we try to be principled and not partisan, because we think in the long run, that gives us a level of trust that we're able to play on, even when we take unpopular positions. We have this track record. Another thing that we've engaged in more, that Jillian has really been one of the people spearheading, is kind of thinking about some of this stuff from an international perspective. I mean, the internet has always been international, and recognizing that how that how to meet the moment, to really stand up for people around the world, is something that we didn't do in the early days, but we've increasingly done over time. And Jillian, I wonder if you could speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, when I came on in 2011, EFF was certainly engaged internationally. We had a role in certain UN processes. We were engaging internationally around copyright, but we hadn't really built up the kind of team and strength that we have now. So around 2011, this was the era of not just the Arab Spring, but also protest movements around the world, as well as WikiLeaks and a number of other international things that really grabbed the world's attention when it came to digital rights. And so I would say from that point onward, we started to grow the international work, to integrate it throughout the organization, to build up coalitions around various different topics. So just as we work domestically on all the issues that Cindy mentioned, internationally, we're also working on free expression, on surveillance, copyright, technology, IP, technology, all of it, across different fronts. And today, all of that work is integrated throughout different teams and working groups at EFF, rather than being sort of isolated in an international team framework. So, that takes on a number of different forms. We work with groups in Europe, for example, with the European Digital Rights Initiative, EDRI. That's a big part of our work. We've got a lot of EU policy work going on, especially over the past few years, as the EU has taken on a lot more regulation of the internet. We also work with coalitions across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, North Africa, and have worked to try to help build out the digital rights movement. We also take on individual cases, and I'm just going to mention one that we've been working on for, unfortunately, way too long, but we're hoping to see it progress soon, which is the case of Egyptian technologist and blogger and activist Alaa Abdel Fattah, who we're hoping to see come home to the UK pretty soon.
Oh, fingers crossed. Allah's a good friend of EFF, and it's just been horrible to watch. The people being persecuted for their digital rights activism in a very old school, thrown in prison kind of way. It's awful to see. So, and I think, as Lee mentioned, U.S. Congress has been a place for a lot of innovation around regulation and policy. Sacramento is a place because so many of the companies are tested here, but the emerging one, it's not even emerging, it's very solid now, is the EU. And so the international work has focus, we do work all around the world, but because the EU is driving so much policy right now, our engagement there has grown quite a bit. And then the other piece that EFF has, kind of developed is our tech projects work. So, EFF hired the very first staff technologist. He's a guy named Seth Schoen, basically so that we could stop bugging academics like Yoshi to explain technology to us, and we'd have people right on staff who could do it. But, what we learned is, techs want to tech. And after a while, we started thinking that one of the ways that we could address some of the problems we were seeing was by building technologies. And so EFF's tech projects has become a fully fledged section of the work that we do. But it started with more of an effort led by our founder, John Gilmore, to build something called the Des Cracker. Yoshi, I don't know if you want to comment a little bit about the role that you think that kind of played in inspiring generations of technologists to think that they could participate in the policy and legal conversations.
That's an excellent question. DesCrack itself predates my involvement in the computer security field by just a little bit, but I know of the impact of the work. And as broader context, one of the things that I feel that the EFF always does is it has its insight on what things can be done now that can have the greatest impact in the long term. DesCrack existed at a time where people were discussing the weaknesses of the DES encryption or block cipher, in particular the weakness being with respect to the short key length. This was something that academics understood as being an issue, but there is a difference between academics and researchers and experts in the field saying it is an issue and people who are not experts believing it is an issue. What the DesCrack machine did was it demonstrated that it was actually possible and feasible to brute force a DES encryption key, thereby demonstrating that yes, it was indeed, or it did indeed not provide a sufficient level of security. And so this transition from being something that academics and researchers understood to be true to being something that academics and researchers could demonstrate actually was true just changed the nature of a conversation. And so again, an example of a project that has huge impact and in my mind is consistent with much of the projects that EFF has done since, both in terms of EFF internally, but also the academic research that the EFF has enabled.
Yeah, and a current example of this is the Privacy Badger, which many people know. I mean, it's got well over, I think, 2 million users now. It's a third-party tracker blocker for Firefox and Chrome. But the history of Privacy Badger is that some of our staff technologists kept going to these meetings where people were trying to develop technical means to block tracking, things like the do not track conversations. And they got so frustrated hearing industry people saying, well, there's just nothing you could ever build that would really work on the internet that would block tracking. Tracking is so important and deep into things. You just can't technically do it. And I remember, I think the technologist was Dan Auerbach, came back from one of these and said, I could just build this and show the world that this could be done. And so Privacy Badger grew out of exactly the same frustration that DesCracker grew out of, which is people in the government and in the industry basically claiming that something was technologically true that wasn't true. And rather than just explain why they were wrong, which doesn't work sometimes, really showing that they were wrong. And so, even today, with Privacy Badger being really a tremendously important tool for people who don't understand anything about tech policy, but to be able to protect themselves, it really grew out of a policy frustration, not anything else. And I think that same spirit exists across a lot of EFF's work right now, which is, what's the best tool to try to demonstrate, the truth, the reality of a situation when there's a kind of reality distortion field happening, whether on the corporate side or the government side.
And I just have to throw this in. I've met people globally over the past few years who came to EFF through Privacy Badger. They learned about Privacy Badger. They were using the tool, sometimes in their own language, because we do translate a lot of these things thanks to a global community of translators. But I just think that's so special that there are people who find our work and learn more about it through the use of these tools.
Yeah. Come for the tracker blocker, stay for the policy. Yeah.
I just have to add that, Dan's insomnia, Dan's inability to sleep, and I sadly was part of that because Dan and I and Jonathan Mayer, we spent a great deal of time in those stupid, interminable W3C meetings that are dominated by, as you know, by corporate interests. I mean, we were barely allowed to be in the room, but we were the only ones who were calling bullshit on what the companies were saying. But after a couple of years of just frustratingly being in there, that's that's really how Dan and then Peter are picking it up, how we got Privacy Badger.
Yeah, Peter Eckersley being our head of technology projects, who sadly passed away since then, but was the steward of a lot of these ideas for many years. Before we open up to questions, I just want to talk about one more thing, and we can talk about the future. We're not getting to our third topic, but I want to open this up. But I think the other really important role for EFF over 35 years is really pushing the growth of the digital rights movement, both directly having people who've spent time with us, spread out all over the world, whether they've been our interns or staffers or some of the people we've mentioned here today have gone on to do other really important things, but also kind of through being hopefully an inspiration to both groups and people to think that this was a thing you could do with your life. And Yoshi, I think you're exhibit A in some of this. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about kind of EFF's role as building out the digital rights movement, but also inspiring it.
Yeah, I am happy to talk about that. One of the things that the first thought that comes to mind is just how much the EFF is in the ecosystem of all my conversations with students and others presently I'm at the University of Washington. And by in the ecosystem of the conversation, I don't mean that like I'm bringing it up, but just in like everyone, all the students, other faculty that I know, think about EFF as kind of like the shining light and the North Star, bringing morality and ethics to the discipline of technology. Elaborating on that a little bit, by that I mean that everyone in my orbit presently at the University of Washington seems to recognize that technology can create harms, and that as technologists, what we want to do is that we want to create technology that's respectful and conscious and thoughtful of society and other people and so on and so forth. And people realize that the EFF is kind of a guiding light towards how to be an ethical computer scientist and think about and prioritize society in the process of doing so. As we're having this conversation, I haven't actually done so, but I'm very curious about looking at the number of laptops that I see open during meetings with EFF stickers on them, just as an indicator of how much. Again, I haven't actually counted, but in my mind, it's quite a high number, just as an indicator of how many people value their identity as being part of and associated with the EFF.
Yeah, I think that's right. I see that as well, and also just and it's definitely true in computer security and computer science, but we also see it in law as well. And one of the big boosts for this is the law clinics, the tech law clinics that are, again, our board member Pam, she's come up a couple times here. Really, she and her husband Bob helped spearhead this idea, and we've worked with those clinics and had interns through those clinics for a long time. And now we have tentacles all over the place in law and technology as well. So it's not just us, but we're hopefully kind of a centerpiece of a lot of work to try to develop out this field. I certainly, our dear friends at the ACLU developing out their amazing capacities to do digital rights work that we work with very closely, was all in correspondence with us. And I think we've also seen that around the world. I know, Jillian, you have been part of helping support digital rights groups around the world. But I did want to call one out before I pass it to you, which is the Software Freedom Law Center India, which is our dear friends. And I'm proud to announce or confirm our EFF award winners for this year, 2025, because they've really built something very special in, a huge and tech focused country, to really stand up on the sides of rights. So I'm happy that they count us as an inspiration, and of course at this point we count them as an inspiration too. But Jillian, I know that that's just one of the examples around the world.
Yeah, I mean, really, there's so many. And I mean, one that I think we can name, we talked about is Gesellschaft für Freiheitsrechte in Germany, GFF, aptly named, close to EFF. We've also just worked with so many groups in various places. And I remember coming into this a little bit later than y'all, but nevertheless, that there were just far fewer digital rights organizations. And so our role was very different. As we've seen all of these different groups grow and begin to thrive, all of these different allies of ours, it's, you know, it's shifted our role a little bit. So I don't want to shout any out specifically, too many to name, but we just have so many allies in so many different countries that we work hand in hand with, and try to support.
Yeah, and I really want to shout out our friends at Access Now who have created RightsCon and a real convening for a lot of these groups. So, you know, we don't do anything by ourselves. You know, we're part of a community, and having you know, colleagues and friends who can play different roles. And I think Access Now has really played a huge role as a convener, and the Keep It On Coalition, some of the work that they've done that just kind of has grown out of this movement. I just want to shout them out because they do such good work, and we're such good friends. Well, I'd like to open it up to questions from folks. I see a lot of things in the chat, and I'm wondering if I want to start with one of them, which is one of the topics that we didn't get to because we ran out of time, which is what are some of the issues we see EFF focusing in the future? And I'll start with a little bit of one, which is, you know, I've always envisioned EFF as being kind of an organization with kind of pillars and values, but being on patrol, right? You know, we're kind of in the world, and when something comes up, we really want to be able to jump to it and step in. And, you know, a couple of examples, again, our Office of Personnel Management case is a case that, you know, I don't think we would have put on our bingo card as something we were going to do in 2020 or 2023 or even 2024. But, you know, standing up for the rights of people whose information is being held by the federal government to not have that information be kept or accessed in an insecure way, as well as a privacy invasive way, is an example of us really being on patrol and being able to jump in when an issue, you know, arises in the world that kind of falls in our world. I think another set of issues is the work that we've been doing with reproductive rights groups, recognizing that surveillance and privacy issues were going to be intimately involved in some of the issues around reproductive rights, and seeing how people's online activities and information are being used to try to track and prosecute them as they're seeking reproductive justice is another one that you know, is us being on patrol and knowing our issues and knowing our topics and seeing things arise in the world and being able to jump in with the expertise and the knowledge in ways that we didn't. Are there other issues that you guys see in the future, Jillian? I don't know. You look like you're ready to say something.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess these are present things, but I just want to kind of jump onto what you just said, Cindy. And I think that, you know, there are so many different rights and justice issues that interact with digital rights that we maybe, you know, didn't see 2 decades ago, but that we're seeing increasingly now. This month, for example, we're doing an LGBT Q&A that answers questions around online safety. And I think it's work like that and the reproductive justice work that sort of guides that vision of going, okay, what other types of rights issues do digital rights intersect with right now?
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, it turns out free speech and privacy are kind of cornerstones to a lot of different fights. And so if those are the things that you care about, and we do, and that's why we care about them, we see them as the basis upon which a lot of other rights and issues have to sit. As things move in the world, our expertise becomes important to things that you know, don't in other contexts maybe impact digital rights. Lee, do you have any thoughts about the future?
I probably have too many thoughts about the future. But one thing I wanted to talk about was, you know, with all of the furor over the rise of AI and the questions about how our data is going to be protected, both from a privacy standpoint as well as from a sort of economic exploitation standpoint, and then even further into the plight of workers and future of work in this world. One of the things that we have been doing on the legislative side, and especially in California, has been much more work with the labor unions and with folks who represent workers overall. And we see, you know, whether it's a SAG-AFTRA strike or whether it's SEIU or folks who work for the government who are being subjected to various AI and automated decision-making tools. This is an area where we've really sort of pivoted or not so much pivoted, but shifted our emphasis, because in the earlier days of EFF, we did not concern ourselves much with labor issues. And now that's become something that we realize we have to focus on, because so much of the impact of the new technologies is falling within the workplace. We always had a workplace surveillance issues, but these have really grown to cover warehouses, to cover a lot of different kinds of workspaces. And, my team, especially on state legislation, has been doing incredible amounts of coalition work with folks in the worker space to try to bring more awareness of how technology affects everyday people. And that's in itself generative for all of our work in the tech sector.
Yeah, and I think that we bring some expertise in recognizing how systems like AI, can work with and support people or can repress them. And it's not black and white. It's really more about thinking through how the technology is being worked and what is it trying to do. Is it trying to predict future human behavior, which is very, very dangerous, or is it serving in a way that really supports workers? And those two things are a little more complicated to try to sort through, but we have the expertise and the history to be able to weigh in a way that is, I think, a little, has got a deeper understanding of both the power of the technology and the risk of it, the power and the promise, as well as the risk of it. Yoshi, do you have thoughts about the where EFF is headed in the future and where we ought to be? As my board member.
It's a very good question. I thought it was a very good question that was asked about where the EFF is heading in the future. I also love the answers because I think they're spot on. I think, Cindy, you began the answer talking about the EFF's core principles and how those will kind of stick with the EFF as it goes into the future. And I think this is very important because it is hard to know exactly what the future will be like. But I am convinced, based off of EFF's past history and my now awareness as a board member, that the EFF has its kind of ear to the ground. It sees what is coming almost before it manifests or as it starts to manifest, and then it addresses it, from the perspective of maintaining those core principles that Cindy, you mentioned. So from my perspective, I don't actually know what issues the EFF will be focusing on, in 35 years from now, but I know that it will be protecting the rights of people around the world, and echoing the earlier conversation about the international focus, which is super great to hear too.
Great, thank you. So many good questions here. The other one I wanted to somebody had mentioned something about personal security, privacy, and personal security as something that is kind of, they called it a non-issue based issue, but I think I would also call it just kind of a nonpartisan issue. And this is something that we've done a lot, and it's interesting to me over time, our work on the surveillance self-defense tools. And trying to help people get educated enough about how to protect themselves as they're going out is and involved in protest or organizing or activities. It doesn't matter what side of an issue you are. People who are out of power face surveillance from people who are in power, and when the people who are in power shift, the same problem happens. And Jillian, I know that you were involved in the early days where we developed the surveillance self-defense materials, which I think were originally aimed more at an international audience, but which we've really brought home. I wondered if you could talk about that work.
Sure. Yeah. When I came on, I think it was a 2-page PDF, and it was great. It was great information, but it was smaller. And in 2014, we got some funding to do a much bigger version of the project. And I remember a bunch of us getting in the EFF conference room and kind of noodling on different ideas and what we wanted to cover. And over time, it's become this massive resource available in, don't know offhand, but I think around 10 or more languages. And we've, consulted with different groups around the world to get their input on it. We've shared the resource out. We've gotten translations donated from other groups as well. So the surveillance self-defense tool and the secure, no, I always screw this one up. The security education companion. Am I getting that right? Are incredible resources that we try to really keep up to date and adapt to different new threats and needs that that come on.
Yeah, and this is the kind of work that's important regardless of who's in power, because there's always somebody who's not in power who wants to organize for change, and making sure that these values of free speech and privacy and organizing are protected, regardless of the political moment, is something that I think is kind of, I point to people when they say, well, why are you doing X today? And I'm like, we've been doing X for 35 years. People, when we sued the government in the OPM case, we had a few people saying, well, why is EFF suing the administration? And I said, we've sued every single administration since 1990. This is not new, because we stand up for values, and those values don't change depending on who's in power. Some of the threats may change a little bit, but the values that we're standing up for don't change. I want to close with, we have a couple minutes left. One of the questions we had is, what can people do? People who are concerned about this, I know that one of the things that got put in the chat, which is great, is that we have these local Electronic Frontiers Alliance groups all across the US. And as Jillian's noted, there are digital rights groups all around the world as well. So one of the things you can do is kind of find them and get involved. We have a nice map on our website. You can find one or start one if you want to kind of look for the local issues, stand up for your values. Obviously, I am the executive director of EFF. You can give to EFF to keep us strong for the next 35 years. But what other things do you think of? I'm going to start with Lee and Jillian, and then Yoshi, for people, the things that people can do who are concerned about standing up for digital rights.
Well, one of the obvious things, since I run the legislative department, is that pay attention to when we are sending out actions about things that need to be communicated to legislators. We try not to activate on every little thing. We try to activate on things that matter. So what I'm always going to hope is that when we do activate, that people take the time to actually contact their legislator and explain why it is that they should pay attention to what EFF is saying. And also, I'm just going to put a plug in for a point that I always like to make, which is that if you are worried about whether or not any business or corporation or entity is actually going to do the things that the law says they should do, you should care about the ability to sue. There should be private rights of action in legislation. When you see companies praising bills, praising laws, 90% of the time, they won't have any way for you to get enforcement. It will rely on some agency to do it for you. And while we need that, we also need ordinary people to be able to band and sue companies for not actually following the law.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And this is a good set of eyes for everyone to have. Like, a right doesn't matter unless there's a remedy. So look for it. Is there a way that you can actually enforce this right? And if not, it's kind of a paper tiger, and you probably shouldn't support it. Or worse, it's a Trojan horse. It's pretending to be change that isn't really change. Jillian?
Yeah, I've got two. One is you can go to EFF.org, up to the top of the page, take action, and then volunteer. We've got a bunch of different ways that people with different skill sets can get involved, and those are all listed there. There's different mailing lists that you can join, if you're a translator, an attorney, etc. Lots of ways to do that. And then the other one I want to speak to is just to students who might be listening. I get a lot of emails from students. I try to answer as many as I can. But I also I teach, and I also work with students who want to get into this field. And I would say that there are just so many more opportunities these days for people who want to work in digital rights, whether you want to go into law or tech or activism. I think that, there's just so many ways to do that. So I encourage young people to get involved in that way as well.
Absolutely. And Yoshi, I'm going to give you the last word. How can people get involved?
There's so many, Okay, lots of excellent comments made earlier from contacting legislators to becoming involved in the EFF. From my perspective as a board member, but also as an academic and in computer science, what I would say is that different people might help the EFF effectively push back in different ways depending on their own backgrounds and expertise. And so there is not one size fits all approach. But as a computer scientist, I would say to those involved in the technology space to just continue to be thoughtful about whether a technology should be built in the first place. And if it is to be built, asking how should it be built? When different stakeholder groups might be impacted with those technologies, working with those stakeholder groups to understand what those impacts might be versus just kind of thinking about what they might be without actually talking with the people from those communities, understanding what the harms might be, understanding what human rights might be negatively impacted, and being mindful in the design of technology. Again, I say this as the computer scientist, but echoing everything that others said already with respect to direct involvement with the EFF.
I think that's a tremendous place to close. EFF was created with a deep understanding of technology, and the thing that makes us different is we understand how technology works and we think carefully about how to do things right. And developing yourself as somebody who cares about technology to understanding how things actually work and how to do things right and the values that are laden in it, that's core to where we go. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you to this amazing panel, and happy birthday EFF. And thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yeah.